Hey, Sue Franz.
Hey, Garth.
Let's do this. Why don't you and I do a season of episodes where we talk about teaching?
Now, Garth, when we have these conversations, would it be okay if I had a beer while we talked?
I would assume that unless people are out there driving, that they are also having a beer with you or a beverage of choice if they don't drink alcohol. That'd be fine. For those who do, definitely encouraged.
I can see some people choosing a nice herbal tea.
We're going to get this thing out before the end of 2020 because we know that people need something fun and entertaining to listen to, and I hope that we can not only offer some good teacher talk, but maybe have some fun doing it at the same time.
Well, you and I are going to have fun. Now, whether anybody enjoys listening to us have fun, I can't help you with.
Well, that's the truth, Sue. You and I have had a lot of fun over the years talking about teaching. It's a passion of ours, and to tell you the truth, I don't like to think about teaching just in my own little bubble. I really love the teaching community. I think you do too. You value that. It's one of the things that I've learned from you. And so what do you say we go on this journey together?
I think that's a fantastic idea, Garth.
Join us for Season 1 of Psych Sessions, Garth and Sue Talk, textbooks, exams, student workload, integrative themes, and so much more. It is a bingeable listening experience, and it will premiere on Thanksgiving Day, Thursday, November 26th. So grab a drink and come join the conversation. This episode of the Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by Pearson Revel, which I think is a game changer for students and teachers. I started using Revel a few years ago, and I can't imagine going back to what I was doing before. Revel helps me feel more responsible as an educator, knowing that my students are receiving evidence-based learning experiences, like retrieval practice. The single best thing about it for me is that it gets students to read. Do you know how long it's been since I've said to a colleague, my students just won't read the book? Yeah, Revel helped me solve that problem. And with that out of the way, I have all kinds of freedom to design the course I want. Now, I assign readings from the text with a click of a button that is delivered to my students as a tracked assignment according to whatever date I schedule. Revel is fully digital and highly engaging. It also has a mobile app that allows students to read, listen, or practice on any device. And students truly like it. So do yourself a favor, check out Revel. Psych Sessions listeners can try Revel out for 1 term at no cost to your students. For more information, please email revel@pearson.com or visit go.pearson.com/psych sessions.
Hello, and welcome to Psych Sessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Eric Landrum, along with Garth Neufeld, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the end stuff. This is episode number 106, where Garth had the opportunity to interview Elizabeth Loftus from the University of California, Irvine, in Irvine, California. Before you hear the interview, please allow me to share some listening tips and my favorite moments. This was a lovely interview, and I'm so pleased that Garth made the arrangements to talk to Elizabeth. I've had the opportunity to get to talk to Elizabeth on a couple of occasions, typically related to the Rocky Mountain Psychological Association. The most recent occurrence was in 2011 when PsychI hosted her. I was the regional vice president, and we invited her to Denver to speak. And it was remarkable just to get to chat with her and have dinner with a large group. And I was able to introduce her as the distinguished speaker that year. And not only is she an amazing psychological scientist, as as the world understands, but she's just also just a lovely human being and delightful to talk to. So it was great to hear her again and have Garth get a chance to speak with her about her career and her background and hear some stories that I hadn't heard before, which was just a real treat. Elizabeth still teaches graduate, undergraduate students. I really enjoyed hearing her talk about Psychology Today as the magazine. I don't think it has the prominence today as it did. It really played an instrumental role in her becoming famous outside of psychology. And in some ways, I kind of drew the parallel that Psychology Today back in the mid-70s for her would have been the social media of the 2020s. And so as you listen to her speak about that, you might either agree or disagree with that conclusion that I took away from it. It's really interesting to hear her talk about the practical application of her work. As you will hear, that became very important to her very early in her research lab about memory and eyewitness testimony. And what I found fascinating, and I think Garth did too in his interview, when she's talking about when it starts to become applied to cases where, for example, repressed memories about sexual abuse. And if you've read widely in psychology, you might know about that. But even more recently, she was asked to make a presentation in the Harvey Weinstein case. And I have it here in my notes. She was just asked to present information about basic memory science. She wasn't asked to make any statements in favor of his defense or opposed to him. But actually, she was kind of exposed to this cancel culture. It was really interesting how even the presentation of the basic science was, I think, politicized and became part of this back and forth volley of whether it should even be presented or not. I thought it was really interesting how influential a lunch with a cousin was in the development of her career. When this lunch with a cousin who happened to be a lawyer, and the cousin asked her, "Have you made any discoveries?" That's a pretty high bar. And so I have a feeling that Elizabeth comes from a pretty powerful family when you're asking those questions. And the response that Elizabeth gives about a bird that is yellow versus a yellow bird is pretty awesome. You know, sometimes you just forget about, these amazing people who are superstars in our field, were once students themselves. And so it was fun to hear Garth talk to Elizabeth about being an undergraduate at UCLA in mathematics and psychology. And I'll let that story unfold for you as you listen to Elizabeth tell it in her own words. I really did get a kick out of hearing Elizabeth talk about how bored she was. I believe it was in graduate school at Stanford. She was in a mathematical psychology PhD program, and how bored she was. And so she'd sit in the back of these lecture halls. And I'm not going to tell you what she said she would do in the back of the room, but it is pretty awesome. So be sure to listen for that. Again, one of the things that I appreciate, and I've come to appreciate about psych sessions, is that, I don't know if this phrase is trademarked, but we've become accidental oral historians. And so I'm sure many of these items have been captured in write-ups about Elizabeth and her life. And obviously she's one of the most important psychologists alive in the world today. And we're so thrilled that she made time for Garth and for us. But I don't know if all of these stories have been told. And so I'm really thankful for this effort and for our chance to listen to it. And so I hope you enjoy it as well.
The Psych Sessions podcast is brought to you by STP, the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. STP's program at APA 2021 will be virtual. Proposals are due by January 12th, 2021. Please visit convention.apa.org/proposals and apply for an STP Excellence in Teaching Award by January 15th, 2021. Click on the Awards Grants tab at teachpsych.org to apply for this and other STP grants and awards. Well, I am here with Dr. Elizabeth Loftus from UC Irvine. Is that right? Is that where you're at now, Dr. Loftus?
I am. Yes.
Okay, perfect. And you used to be at the University of Washington, about 2 miles from where I'm sitting right now. How long were you there for?
I taught at UW for 29 years.
Wow. And but you're from Los Angeles originally, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And did you how did you find your way up to UW?
Well, I was married to Jeffrey Loftus, and we met in graduate school. And when we got out of graduate school, we had a two-body problem. So we, struggled living apart for a number of years, and finally found two jobs at the University of Washington.
And then you put down some roots there for a few decades.
Exactly.
Right on. Well, I just want to tell you how excited I am to talk to you today. I have been teaching Elizabeth Loftus research and theories for a long, long time. So it's quite a privilege to sit down with you. I appreciate that you're doing this. And I think there are so many introductory psychology professors out there who teach memory out of a textbook each and every year, who are well aware of what you have contributed, some of the major pieces that you've contributed to our field. And so I have a feeling that listeners and I have a feeling that I will just have a lot of fun in our conversation today. So no pressure, but that's what I'm expecting.
Okay. If I can live up to that.
Oh, well, I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. So you are still in the classroom, is that right? Yes.
I teach graduate students and undergraduates.
Okay. And you are not only in what school are you in over there? Is it criminology and how?
Oh, it's a complicated situation at UC Irvine. Psychologists are spread around to a number of different departments, not just isolated into one major department like my former university. So I have appointments in the Department of Psychological Science, in another department, criminology, law, and society. I'm a professor of law and also have a strong connection to the cognitive sciences department.
Wow. Did you see yourself getting into, or maybe at what point in your career did you see yourself getting into the more criminal justice side of kind of specialization? Area.
Well, I never expected that to happen. When I was in graduate school, I was a cognitive psychologist, although we maybe didn't call ourselves that exactly in those days.
What did you call yourselves?
Oh, learning.
Okay.
Learning, I think was the word, and I was in mathematical psychology also. In graduate school, but Ulrich Neisser's book Cognitive Psychology came out in the middle of when I was a graduate student, and I think that helped steer us all towards calling ourselves cognitive psychologists. But it was after I got my PhD and after I was studying eyewitness memory for crimes and accidents and other legally relevant events that I started to get connected to the legal field.
Right. So what you were doing in the laboratory all of a sudden became relevant in an applied way, and you became an expert in it.
Well, exactly. And, I attribute a lot of that connection to an article that I published in Psychology Today magazine that spoke to the public about the potential application of work on eyewitness memory to the real world, to the legal field.
Wow.
that publication was 1974. And that's when I started to get all kinds of calls from lawyers.
That's really interesting, because today we could say, you know, some cognitive psychologist who's working on a new application, real world application of a theory or something like that, or bringing their laboratory into the real world, that we could see that getting published and then getting shared widely, social media, links sent in emails. How does this happen quickly in 1974, or does it kind of spread slowly, like this article? And how did you see that? Have you ever thought about how that process gets passed on in 1974?
Well, yes. I mean, sure, it was way pre-internet and social media and the kind of life we live now with the, you know, super highway of the internet. Back then, publishing an article in Psychology Today magazine, that magazine was so popular back then. And people read it not only because if they were studying psychology or interested in psychology, but many members of the legal profession read that magazine. It might have had a circulation of about 1 million or so. It was huge. So when I published this article in Psychology Today magazine, it reached a whole lot of people. And then from there, you know, like lawyers wanting me to work on their cases or wanting me to speak at their professional meetings to other lawyers about what psychology might be able to contribute. And then the rest is kind of maybe word of mouth. People writing articles about it in professional magazines in the legal field. And I think that's how the information spread. And conferences and speeches.
Right. Yeah, of course. Now, this may be, I'll ask some silly questions. I'll put myself out there, but here's a question. When folks beginning then, when you were getting these calls in from lawyers, did you see this as, they just want to win, or they care about their client's innocence, or it's my duty? Like, at what point maybe did social justice kind of play into it for you, or just being true to science and the findings? What are all the variables that you have considered from that point on as you have participated on, I think, mostly legal defense teams, I imagine?
All kinds of different things. There is no one answer to that question. I mean, certainly defense lawyers want to use whatever tools are available to vigorously defend their clients, and that's their obligation. And as far as I was concerned, when I first started out, I was interested in being able to see real live witnesses and how they're questioned and how they operate in the real world. And consulting on these legal cases gave me a window into the real world of eyewitness testimony, not just the laboratory world, that I wouldn't have had without it. And I didn't think it was my job to decide whether a person was guilty or innocent. Usually when an attorney would call me up, they would say something like, I don't know whether he did it or not. Or they would say, this is my worst nightmare. I'm pretty sure I have an innocent client. And that is kind of a nightmare situation, because you feel so much responsibility as an attorney, almost even more so when they're innocent than when they're guilty. But lawyers weren't calling me up saying, I know he did it, I want you to help me get him off.
Right.
Wouldn't have been too comfortable with that kind of conversation.
Yeah. So you have been in this capacity as an expert witness. You've been doing that for 40 years at this point in time. And you've worked on some pretty high profile cases over the time. And how have you served the science of the psychological science that you have worked on in your entire career? How have you used that as kind of the value or a main value as you enter into these cases where you might get some backlash from people and organizations based on your testimony.
A typical kind of case might be a lawyer calls up and says, I'm representing this client. Who's accused of some crime, and the only evidence or is the testimony of an eyewitness. And I wonder if you would, consult on this case and help me evaluate. Sometimes in a 20-minute phone call, they tell me enough, and where I say, given that fact pattern, I'm not sure that a memory scientist can help you very much. But if they tell me that there was a very brief exposure, that there was a very long retention interval, that there was a whole lot of biased media coverage, that there was a lineup that was ultimately conducted, and it was conducted in a particular way that it's obvious from the scientific literature it wasn't an ideal lineup, that maybe it was a cross-racial identification where a member of one race is trying to identify a stranger of a different race, then I say you've got a lot of factors in that fact pattern where a memory scientist could provide some testimony that might be useful to your case. And then I would read police reports, preliminary hearing testimony, any statements the eyewitness made, look at photographs, learn a little bit about how the identification test was conducted, and then shape a direct examination around these factors. And I don't go so far as to say this memory is accurate or not accurate, only that there are a lot of factors in this situation that can create problems for accurate eyewitness memory.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So, but I know this, I've heard you talk about this before, the fact that, sometimes what you're giving to people is not what especially the court of public opinion is looking for, which is sometimes people want justice and they don't want to hear about all of these the nuances of maybe human memory, and so I know that probably in the past you have gotten some backlash. I know that you've also not taken on certain cases because of some of, maybe not those considerations, but some of the considerations you're talking about where you maybe don't have as much to contribute. But how has the kind of the court of public opinion shaped the way the way you approach your role in criminal justice?
Back in the early days when I was working on murder cases and robbery cases and any kind of, backlash or whatever would primarily, I guess, come from prosecutors, because prosecutors, mostly the eyewitness experts, were testifying on behalf of defendants in these criminal cases. It's usually the prosecution that's bringing forward this eyewitness, and the defense thinks there are problems with the eyewitness and wants some assistance from a scientist to evaluate and potentially challenge that eyewitness testimony. So it would be mostly prosecutors, and occasionally a few experimental psychologists who thought maybe the application to these real cases was a little premature. But the arguments and the fight was fairly friendly. I remember some experimental psychologists criticizing this application or some of the work that was used as part of the defense testimony. We even duked it out in the pages of the Journal of Experimental Psychology. But then one of these opponents would turn around and ask me for a letter of recommendation for a promotion of his, or for when he was considering another job. That's what I mean by, it was fairly civil. But then when I began to work on these delayed memory sex abuse cases, that's when things got pretty vicious. And when I began to see these bizarre accusations where people were accusing their parents and their other relatives and neighbors based on claims of massive repressed memory that had returned in questionable psychotherapy. And I started to speak out about the potential for innocent people being snared in this net. The attacks got kind of vicious. People, threatened organizations that invited me to speak with lawsuits, or threatened death threats. And I remember being at the University of Michigan lecturing once, and they had to hire a police officer to accompany me all day while I was on the Michigan campus. Eventually, there was a lawsuit where I wrote about a case where a mother had been accused of sex abuse, and it was a suspicious case that I had investigated. And the accuser ended up suing me and my co-author based on our expose about the case, even though we never named the accuser. So, there were some pretty unpleasant things that happened by people who didn't want to hear this message.
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking about, now you went to Stanford University, is that right?
For graduate school.
For graduate school. I interviewed Albert Bandura not too long before the pandemic started, and he told a story about going in front of Congress, I think in the 50s, and having a lot of backlash because it wasn't what he was providing. The testimony that he was providing was not what the public wanted to hear. I can't think of too many instances, and maybe my memory is just not long enough, but I can't remember too many instances where psychologists were, in the crosshairs of the public. And you've kind of remained there in some ways. I know that you were working with the Harvey Weinstein case, and you are giving your opinion, your expert opinion on these things. But and maybe I'll just take that opportunity to talk about where, with all of your experience, what are you seeing out there? These are crazy times. This will air after the election is over, but we're in this fake news era. We have an election. We've had the Me Too movement recently. We've had Black Lives Matter. We've had so many things going on, and a lot of the media is really involved with kind of getting people to buy in to what they are giving, whatever proper information or false information or misinformation. As Elizabeth Loftus, do you look at the world right now and differently than maybe a non-psychologist who hasn't studied memory a lot? Where do you watch the news and think, oh, I know what's going on here? Is there anything that sticks out to you? I realize that was a very long question.
That was a super long question. Well, first of all, it is true that when the media writes up a story, generally they have to make their story sexy. Let's call it that. They want the story to be of interest to people. They want it to sell. And sometimes they sensationalize rather than laying out the cold, hard facts on both sides and letting people decide for themselves. And so, this did enter my conscious awareness when I had to decide whether to be involved in the New York case against Harvey Weinstein, because there had been so much publicity in the media about him. He was so much painted as a monster. And I was resisting actually going to New York to be a part of that case. And when I asked myself, why are you resisting? It was because I was being seduced by the media without investigating the facts for myself. I was being seduced by the media, and I've been yelling at people for decades not to let this happen. I was also worried that involvement in that case would hurt my ability to help other people maybe who were more obviously completely innocent. And so I thought, well, if I bow out for those reasons, I'm just going to feel like a coward. And so I agreed to go to New York and just present information just on the basic memory science, not commenting on any specific people at all. And still, I got enormous backlash. One of the first things that happened is I got canceled, so I'm part of the cancel culture now. I was invited to give a big deal speech a couple of months later. The speech was to occur a couple of months later in New York, at New York University. The plane tickets had been bought, and I get an email from the university saying, due to unforeseen circumstances, we have to cancel your lecture. And when I tried to find out what was the reason for the cancellation, maybe they could have written and said, well, we double booked the venue or whatever. But that's not what happened. The person just didn't answer and didn't answer a second request for information and didn't answer when the media started contacting NYU to get an answer. But we know what the reason was. So, yeah, that's the climate. We're in a cancel culture climate. And I've seen, this also happen to other friends of mine, wonderful psychologists. So maybe you'll have a conversation with Steven Pinker, who fended off an incredible attempt to get him kicked out of the Linguistic Society of America.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating conversation, certainly. So when you go into these, the Weinstein, when you're walking into the courtroom there, did you ever get nerves going into court? Do you still get nerves going into these high profile cases, knowing that what you could say could affect outcomes?
Well, that particular case, the Weinstein case, was a little nerve-wracking because there were throngs of reporters lining the walls and yelling out questions and that doesn't happen in a typical case.
Right. Yeah. So your position is you have a job to do. You're going to go in and do your job.
Right.
Generally. Yeah.
Of course, at this point in my career, frankly, I prefer to take on the cases of people who are highly likely, in my opinion, to potentially be innocent. In the beginning of my career, I thought, well, everybody paid for science. Science is there for everyone. It's not my job to decide, is the person guilty or not? That's the job of the jury. My job is really to present the science of memory. And so I didn't think about it very much. But, these days now, because I can work on so many cases and can't work on all the cases that come my way, I can pick and choose a little bit.
Yeah. What's it like to, and I'm sure you have been a part of a case, although I don't remember you saying explicitly, but I think you have been part of a case where somebody has gone away for a long time and your testimony in part helped free an innocent individual. What is that like when you see a case go that way and it's definitive, in some ways? Is that really special to be a part of?
It's certainly special, and to play a small role in helping somebody who's innocent. It's a very special feeling. But when it comes to an expert and the expert's role, I think you can't. It's a shared credit. I mean, there's an attorney there who was aware enough of the memory research to think to contact a memory scientist, to bring them in to do the work. I mean, and so the skills of the attorney and so many other factors come into play to lead to a particular verdict. I kind of don't like it when other experts will say, something like, 80% of cases I've testified in have resulted in an acquittal, because it's really not their acquittal. It's certainly a group effort. And then I've had the awful feeling when I get involved in a case and the person is convicted, and and I think they're innocent, and it's haunting. It's a nightmare, like the lawyer's nightmare when they're representing someone they truly believe is innocent.
Now, you could have at some point in your career just continued to do research. You had a pretty steady job, and you didn't have to get out there and make this kind of difference or contribution. Was there a moment where did you say to yourself, yeah, I'll try this out? Or was there a moment you thought that this was something that needed, like psychological science really needed to move out of your laboratory and into these other spaces? Because you probably could have been very successful just continuing to do, and I know you've continued research as well, but only doing that.
No, well, the way it happened is I was doing, I made the decision after I'd been out of graduate school that instead of studying more theoretical memory issues, that I wanted to do something that had more practical applicability.
Okay.
It basically happened because I had lunch with a cousin of mine. My cousin was a lawyer, and she said to me, now, you're an experimental psychologist. Have you made any discoveries? And I said, yes, I have. Well, what are your discoveries? I said, well, for example, with my collaborator, we discovered that people are faster to give you the name of a bird that's yellow than to give you the name of a yellow bird. They're faster by about 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second. And she just looked at me and she said, and how much did we pay for that result? And I thought, oh, gee. Well, of course, this was a finding in the field of semantic memory. These reaction time data tell us something about the storage and retrieval of semantic information, how our knowledge is stored. But it was after that conversation that I thought, I really want to study something that has more obvious practical relevance. And that's how I started studying memory for crimes and accidents and other legally relevant events. And after I'd been doing that for a few years, some of my early laboratory studies on eyewitness testimony, I thought, I really want to see a real witness in a real case. And by this time, I was teaching at the University of Washington. I knew one of the chief attorneys. He was a family friend in the public defender's office. And I volunteered my services for free. I said, I know something about eyewitness testimony. I'd consult on your case for free if I could just hang out with you and watch you do interviews and be a part of the case. And I'll, give you whatever assistance I can give. And I worked with this attorney on a murder case where a woman was accused of murdering her boyfriend. The defense was self-defense. And that is the case. She was acquitted. And that's the case I wrote about in the Psychology Today magazine, along with some discussion of the early science. So I entered that field because I thought I would learn something that would enrich my thinking. And not because I ever thought, gee, I'd like to become an expert in these cases. My graduate students now, they want to become an expert. And I mean, they see that these are experiences that are really valuable. They enliven the teaching. They enliven your writing and publication. Of course, you can get compensated for your time. And so I've got a number of students now who are serving as expert witnesses in court cases around the country.
You mentioned your early research. Maybe let's just back up to this. Where did you do your undergraduate degree?
I was at UCLA. I majored in mathematics first, and then I ended up taking some electives in psychology. I got hooked on my intro psych course. I took a whole bunch more psychology, so I graduated with a double major in mathematics and psychology. And
then what was the next? First of all, do you remember what hooked you in intro psych? Was it the instructor or the content or?
It was the instructor, Alan Parducci. He was just, I don't even remember why. He told some joke and I don't even remember the joke, but I don't remember particularly the content, but I just loved the course and the material. I mean, maybe after calculus.
Yeah, maybe it was more appealing.
This was kind of exciting.
Yeah. So you at some point double major, and then from there you go straight to Stanford?
Yes, because Stanford had a program in mathematical psychology. They were the top university. They were the top psych department in general, but they were especially strong in mathematical psychology. And I thought, well, that must be perfect for me. I've got this double major. And I went to Stanford to study mathematical psychology.
Is that statistics based, or what does mathematical psychology mean?
Well, using mathematical models to try to describe and predict behavior.
Okay. Interesting.
I never got hooked on mathematical psychology. I was kind of bored with it, and I would sit in the seminars and try to be interested, but I wasn't very interested. And I would sit in the back. I'd write letters to my Uncle Joe and other relatives. I'd hem my skirts. And the other graduate students noticed that I wasn't paying a great deal of attention and actually voted me the least likely to succeed.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because, and by the way, that's a terrible award that people would hand out.
I think they did it informally and maybe jokingly, but
yeah. Okay. Well, there you go.
And then I eventually found out about it.
Well, I was just reading kind of with intro psych textbooks, at least, most mentions of like constant across psych. You probably know where I'm going with this, but your name and your work has been cited in the top 20 or top 25 of all introductory psychology citations. And I think if I looked correctly, the only woman in that list as well, which I think is fascinating. So to hear that you were back in the back of the classroom hemming your skirts is pretty ironic, I think, in the end. What do you make of that? Your contribution to really nearly 2 million students, 1.5 to 2 million students a year who get to see this work in an introductory psychology course. What does that mean to you?
It's certainly heartwarming to feel that you're having an impact. I've been going to England every other year or so to speak to 3,000 or so A-level budding psychologists taking A-level psychology over in England. So they're quite familiar with this work. And this is not what you're asking about, but so a lot of these psychology students want to be my Facebook friend. And so I have a lot of Facebook friends that I friend all these psychology students who want to. I think that it's kind of a nice thing to do. And so I have a lot of friends who I don't really know. There was a while there where Facebook had this policy of asking you if you were logging on from a computer they didn't recognize. They would try to find out if it was really you by showing you the name of the picture of one of your friends, and then a multiple choice test. Then you had to identify 5 of your friends. And I couldn't pass this test, so I couldn't get onto my Facebook account. They do things differently now, so I don't have that problem anymore. But
oh, that's such a great story. Well, I'll tell you from experience of teaching intro psych for 15 years that when we get to your work, it's some of the most engaging stuff that my students absolutely love. So, I think we're doing probably good jobs of creating cognitive psychologists first year of their introductory psychology course.
Thank you.
Yeah. So early career, how did you get into memory? If you were in this mathematical psychologist program, you graduate with that degree, I imagine, right?
Well, I was in the math psych program. My advisor was part of the math psych world, but I took a course from a professor. His name is Jonathan Friedman, a social psychologist who became a prominent social psychologist. And he had a side project on memory. And he said, would you like to work on this project with me? And that's how I started to work on semantic memory with Jonathan Friedman. And what I loved about that work is, in contrast to the work I had been doing before, and I really learned for the first time how to design an experiment, how to create the stimulus materials, how to run the subjects. I ran the subjects myself, how to analyze the data, how to write up an article for publication, how to get it submitted and get it published. So I learned how to be an experimental psychologist, start to finish, through that process of working with this professor. And that's how I got into the field of memory. And we published a number of papers together. In fact, one of my most cited papers, if you look at the Web of Science, is one of these semantic memory papers. But again, then after a few years after my PhD, I made that decision that I wanted to study a kind of memory for something that had more obvious practical applicability.
Right. And was UW your first job out after? So you did this memory research at Stanford, and then did you do a postdoc, or did you go right to UW?
After Stanford, I went to New York City. I taught for a few years at the New School. This was a period of time when my husband, Jeff Loftus, he was a year behind me, so he graduated. We were looking for jobs together, and so we ended up finding these 2 jobs at the University of Washington. But I do have to say it was a difficult situation for us, because we had lived apart for extended periods as we tried to find jobs together. And when the University of Washington first came to us, they offered him a job, but they offered me only a postdoc. And I'd already been an assistant professor in New York, and I didn't want to go back to being a postdoc. And so I turned down the postdoc offer. And a year later, I got a job offer from Harvard, and the University of Washington heard about that and made me a regular job offer. But now I had to decide, do I go to Harvard or do I go to Washington? They didn't want me enough to offer me a real job the year before. And there's Harvard. And my husband said, look, we finally have a chance to be together. If you go to Harvard, we're going to get a divorce. And so I said, well, could I have a couple weeks to think about it? He said, no, you can't have that long. So he gave me a little time to think about it. And I talked to various of my advisors. The advisors said things like, if you have to give up anything, serious for Harvard, I don't think you should do it, because Harvard doesn't grant tenure to people. And so I ended up deciding that I would go to Washington to save my marriage and give up the chance to teach at Harvard.
Wow.
It's a long two-body problem, and how it was finally resolved.
Yeah. Do you ever think of, or maybe I could ask, what opportunities do you think you were giving up at Harvard now in retrospect? How would it have served you better? Just maybe the fact that it's Harvard versus the University of Washington.
Well, it's hard to know. I think certainly in those days, people, ended up staying at Harvard. The routine was, you'd be there for 7 years and then you'd be kicked out. And if you ended up at a place that was as good as Washington, you'd be happy. But I certainly think that Harvard could, provide some opportunities and connections and experiences. Who knows what those might be? But fortunately for me, I found a way to have many of them without Harvard.
Right. So what was the memory research like? What did we know about memory before you started really studying it? Like, where was the field at on knowledge about memory? How accurate was it?
What was mostly going on is that people were studying memory with very simple stimuli. Lists of words, maybe sentences, occasionally individual pictures, and seeing what people could remember or forgetting curves using these very simple stimuli. My work was different because I was showing people these very rich materials, films of crimes and accidents, and studying their memory. And of course, because of the materials, the work had more kind of, I guess, ecological validity, if you want to call it that, because it looked a little closer to the kind of real world event that I wanted to be able to think about. And there had certainly been earlier work that looked at the reconstructive nature of memory. I probably didn't know that much about that work at the time, but I would certainly learn about it in subsequent years. The work, for example, by Bartlett, who studied people's memories for these complex stories and how those memories got reconstructed in repeated tellings. But that was a little bit different. I do remember one day having a conversation with one of my former Stanford professors, Gordon Bauer, who was always a great cheerleader for his students, and even for people who were not officially his students, but he stayed close to. And he said to me, well, this sort of applied memory work you're doing, it'll probably never get you elected to the National Academy of Sciences, but I think it's really important work. So he's trying to pay me this compliment, but sort of telling me that maybe it's looking a little too applied for you to maybe be perceived as being a real scientist. Of course, he'd be, happily be proven wrong some decades later when I finally did get elected.
Wow. In the last, couple decades, we've learned so much about the brain. And so you were observing all these things probably back before we had really good ways of looking at the brain and understanding the systems involved in memory. And I know that's not your specific area, but as the decades have gone along and you have learned all of these biological functions of memory and watched other psychologists and neuropsychologists kind of study these things, how has that, what were you onto early on that maybe you understood a little bit better once you understand the biology of some of these things?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think very much, maybe because I don't have a lot of expertise in the neurophysiology of memory. Anybody wants to know about that, I direct them to the super experts in the field. But what I like about my contribution is that I study behavior, phenomena, and I think these phenomena are what in a way what survive in the long run in the field of psychology.
Yeah, definitely. How have those early findings stood up over time for you? I imagine pretty well.
There are probably now hundreds, thousands, it's hard to know, studies of the misinformation effect, showing that new information that enters your consciousness after some event is over can change what you remember, can alter, contaminate, transform your memory. So I think that misinformation effect has certainly stood up pretty well.
Yeah. Do you ever get concerned about the ethics of people understanding that this is how things work and to use it for their own benefit, to their own end in maybe unethical ways? Is that a concern?
Oh, well, I have certainly worried about that. So, for example, I collaborated on one study where we fed misinformation to soldiers who had undergone a horrific half-hour aggressive, hostile, stressful interrogation. And we distorted their memory in a way that caused them to identify the wrong person who had conducted this interrogation. And I thought to myself, once we publish these results, we're basically teaching people how they can traumatize someone and then change the memory and wipe away the memory of the true perpetrator. This could be potentially put in the wrong hands and used for nefarious purposes. But we decided it was more important to publish these results and get this information out there so people could then be aware of the potential and maybe then work on some ways to counteract it.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's very, very, very interesting to think about how those contributions can be used for good and for harm. And I realize it's a balance for you and probably at every turn an ethical consideration sometimes. I don't know that I could talk with you forever, but I don't know that I have too many more questions for you, except that I do want to ask, what is after a career that has been so influential, how do you determine your next steps? Are you still writing? Are you doing research? Do you like being in the courtroom? What do you like to do? What do you want to do? Obviously, you're in the classroom still.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what I want to do next. I know I don't want to write any more textbooks. I think I'm done with textbooks. I want to keep interacting with students. I want to keep doing research. I've got collaborations going with a number of people around the world and that's very fun for me. I want to be taken over and consumed again the way I was when I stepped into the memory wars in the 1990s. I don't know how that's going to happen or when it's going to happen or what's going to make that happen, but I'm looking for that excitement, that intellectual excitement, so I can experience it again anew.
Oh, well, that would be awesome. I hope you find that. Do you see that happening with obviously the big thing? And, we're a few days from the election, but do you see that happening? Or maybe I should ask, what's the interaction between memory and politics right now? What are you seeing?
Oh, well, right now, I think the big problem is disinformation and misinformation. We have like an infodemic going on. There's, all kinds of information floating around on that internet superhighway that some of it's true and some of it's not. And So I think there are going to be some great opportunities there for trying to figure out how can we protect people from misinformation and disinformation.
Right. And some of that has been in the media recently with Facebook and Twitter. And has anybody reached out to you yet about these particular situations?
Well, a journal editor reached out to ask me to write something about it. So I'm working on that with one of my former graduate students.
Well, if you could just solve this whole problem for us, I would really appreciate it. 'Cause
I'll see what I can do.
Well, it is hard, I think, just to be an average person. And of course, you have a lot of knowledge. Some of us who are in the field have a little bit of knowledge. And then many people out there don't have any way to sort through or any kind of scientific foundation to be able to sort through all this information and disinformation that's coming at them. And so, I would love to see psychological science step in and hopefully solve that. So no pressure. But I would. I really love seeing what you've done. I love seeing psychology applied to really help people's lives and help us get to more truth. Maybe get some people released who are locked up or whatever. Anyway, I really appreciate your work and contributions, and I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today.
It's been great talking to you.